Hey everybody, I'm Taylor Hokanson, and in this video I'm going to be doing an absolute bare bones introduction to Blender. So if you've never used Blender before, it's an open source program, it's free, and it's been around for a long time. So some open source programs you can't really depend upon the developers maintaining them, or you might be worried that they'll just evaporate at some point, but Blender has clearly established itself as being both very powerful and also being really well run. So it's not perfect. But one of the benefits you can't argue with is just going online and downloading it for free. So here I am at blender.org. If I head to the download section, you can see the version that I'm working with is 3.0. So as you're looking around online, you'll see there are a lot of tutorials for things before version 3. If you get into, I think it's around version 2.7 and earlier, you'll see that the user interface of Blender looks totally different. So when you're looking at tutorials, I'd try to stick to 2.8, 2.9, and then 3 only came out as of this videotaping a month or two ago. But hopefully there'll be more and more tutorials online. So I've gone around online. I've put together a whole bunch of different tutorials and used them to inspire this tutorial. So you may also find some videos online that are familiar, and I'll try to credit as many people as I can in the comments. So I've downloaded Blender 3. I'm working on, I think it's about a 4-year-old MacBook Pro. I also have a 3-button mouse, and then I have a Wacom tablet that has pressure pen interfaces for different approaches here. You can get away with a trackpad for a little while. A 3-button mouse is pretty much the minimum equipment you want to be working with, and having a pen with pressure input is also pretty much required once we get into texture painting and then also some of the more advanced sculpting. So I've already got Blender installed. I'll just come over here and take a look at it. And the first thing we're going to do is talk about a couple of the crucial preferences. So up here under, let's see, it's Edit and Preferences. And if I look here on the left, there's a couple things you want to set up. So first of all, interface. For my old eyeballs, I needed to change the resolution scale to be greater than 1. So at 1.3, the text shows up a little larger, just makes it easier for me to read. One thing to note is that as you move up the UI, you'll start to, in some cases, have certain buttons hidden that you have to scroll to find. So we'll see an example of that later. So that's the interface. Under the input, you want to click on Emulate Numpad, at least if you're on a computer like I have, because I have no numpad on my laptop. If you have a full-size PC keyboard with a numpad, that you wouldn't have to do this. And I've also got Emulate 3-button mouse clicked, even though I'm working with a 3-button mouse, and this will make it easier to work with my pen later. So even if you have a mouse, you can have this checked, but you definitely want to make sure that this is checked if you do not have a 3-button mouse and if you're working with a tablet, for example. And then right here you can also note the particular key that I'm using as the extension key is Alt, and so that'll become more important in a little while. So you want to have these things checked too. And then finally, just something to make you aware of, but we'll come back to later. There's tons and tons of add-ons. Many of these add-ons ship with Blender, but they are not checked because they're sort of optional. And then there's stuff you can go out there and install that, non-Blender Foundation folks have made. So for example, if I look up Screencast, this is one, I can't remember if I downloaded this or not, but this is one that I'll be using through this tutorial. And you can see it causes this little mouse to appear down here. And so whenever I click the buttons or type on the keyboard or whatever, it'll show you what I'm doing. I'll try to say out loud when I do those things as well, but that's another piece of information you can use to follow along. Okay, great. So there's many other things in the preferences you might want to mess around with, units of measure, stuff like that, but these are the crucial ones for at least following this video. Okay, so I've got Blender here. Personally, all of my background for the most part is in Rhino, and so Blender definitely looks a lot different. First of all, we're just working with one major viewport, right? So in some 3D modelers, you're going to have 4 viewports at the same time. There's probably a way to do that in Blender, but I find you don't really need to. And then there can be a little bit of an overwhelming thing here just with all of the different sort of buttons that are organized in this thing that just gets super deep. And then everything is associated with hotkeys in Blender. So if you watch a bunch of tutorials online, you'll see people make these PDF cheat sheets with these long lists of sometimes multi-key hotkeys to get everything done. So we'll get into a couple of those, But don't worry if you see this and it looks kind of overwhelming. I just hit N to hide this menu over here. We're really going to use a fairly small selection of tools to get us started, and we're going to carry all the way through in this introductory set of videos, or video, depending on how I edit it. We're going to get all the way through to making some simple models, putting a material on it, lighting it, and rendering it. You'll find it's a lot simpler than you might believe. So in the default workspace, up here at the upper left, if I look at this little button, you can see that in each of these areas, I believe is the technical term Blender uses, you have the opportunity to reset this window to serve a bunch of different functions. So right now, the main area is set up as the 3D viewport. If I come over here to the right, I can see that this area, this editor type, is called an outliner. So if you're familiar with Photoshop, for example, I guess Rhino does layers too. This is sort of where the layers take place. So I have my scene collection and the objects that are there. By default, when I open up Blender, I'll have a camera, the default cube, and a light. But this is where effectively everything that I add to the scene will be organized. Down here in the lower right, I guess they're not calling it an area, they're calling it an editor. So here we have the properties, and these take a little getting used to as well. So you can kind of go through down here, and if I want to change things about the render, about output, I think this one is world, this one pertains specifically to objects and so on. And these little tabs will change depending on the type of object I have selected. So you see now I have different options here. If I click on the light, now this lighting tab is one of the options that I have. So this one also gets quite deep too. It can be easily confusing. So we'll work primarily with these three editors. Down here at the bottom, this one is the timeline, and we're not going to get into that until later in this video series with animation and so forth. So for this particular video, we're just going to leave the timeline alone and not really worry about it. So 3D navigation around the workspace, there's a couple of ways to get at it. The first one that I can see up here is called the Gizmo. And so this is the gizmo for the entire document. I can drag this thing around. Right, so this is sort of my rotating the view. I can also use this area to zoom, so I'm doing this all with the left mouse button, holding down and dragging up and down, and then holding down here for pan. So rotate, zoom, and pan are the three major navigation types we're going to be looking for. If I want to show and hide this gizmo, I don't know why you really would want to do that, but you can click here on this button to get rid of that stuff. And if I click here, I can get more options related to the gizmo, and we're going to come back and look at object gizmos a little bit later. But for right now, we're just talking about viewport gizmos. So if you don't see them, it might just be that you need to toggle on right there. Now, if I'm going to do this just from my mouse, and I don't want to have to move my mouse all the way over to here, I have my 3-button mouse, and a lot of this is going to take place with the middle mouse wheel. So if I hold it down and then move this thing around, drag the mouse, by default, that's my rotate. If I use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out, that's my zoom. And then for pan, I'm going to need a modifier key. And if I recall, I believe it is shift, right? So shift plus the middle mouse button is what helps me pan the view around. Now, if you're working with a pen, things are going to be a little bit different. So rotate is going to be Alt plus pen button number 1. Alt Control pen number 1 is zoom, and Alt Shift pen number 1 is pan. At least that's how I have it set up. So it's possible that it might be different on your computer, depending on how you set it up through, say, the tablet preferences. But at least that's how it's working on my machine. Although for this particular tutorial, I'm just going to be using the mouse. And I think when I'm working on the pen, you'll still see it show up as if it's a mouse down here. So I suppose that could be a little confusing. Okay, so zoom, pan, and rotate. We have those covered both with our 3-button mouse and with our viewport gizmos. Let's see. There are also numbered views. So right now I'm emulating a numpad, and if I click on 1, for example, I'm going to pop directly into this straight down the y-axis view. If I hit 2, that's going to start to rotate it in increments. Go to 3, that's going to give me an x-axis view and so forth. I think some people like to work in that way. I can never memorize those, but what I can do is I can just come up here and I can click on one of these little gizmo endpoints, and that's going to pop me into one of those views. I find this easier than just memorizing those particular numerical inputs, but maybe memorizing is your thing. You should also note that when we pop into one of those views, we are actually toggling between parallel and perspectival. So if I were to take this cube and make it super long, which I can just do real quick, and we'll talk about how to do this later. But if I make it long enough, of course, right, I'll see that it appears to be wider over here and narrower over there. And that's because we are viewing this in the same way that our eyeball or a camera views the world, in a perspectival view. Now, if I click on this little gizmo right here, I can switch from perspective to orthographic. And now it starts to look really strange, right? But that's because we no longer have those parallel views tending to meet in the distance. So here my dimension right there is exactly the same visually as my dimension right there. And this can sometimes make it easier to make something with precision. Sometimes people also just like the style of how this looks. You can render out in both perspective and parallel views. So you'll note that if I look at it here and I'm just kind of flying around with my mouse, and then I click on one of these views, it is switching into parallel view. And then when I come back out by dragging the gizmo, then that switches me back to a perspective view. So perspective on the one hand, orthographic or parallel are the ways of talking about this other type of view. Okay, so I tend to work in perspective because it's just less confusing to my eye. Okay, so moving right along, let's talk a little bit about transformation, which would be changes in scale, rotation, and what's the last one I'm thinking of? Scale, rotation, and location, I guess, are the three that we're looking at. So if I hit N, that's N as in Nancy, I can get a whole bunch of options here on the right, and I may well have more than U because, for example, I have screencast keys installed. But if I go to Item, I'm going to see that the default cube right here is currently located at XYZ0. So by default, many items have their origin point at their center, so that's important to note. So it's located at 0 relative to the center of the object. Right now there's no rotation, but then under scale we do see some elements right here. So this is one of the interesting and sometimes confusing things about the way that Blender remembers transformations to an object. They stay live until you accept those transformations, and that can come with some gotchas down the line. So it can be very convenient if you want to mess around with how this thing is oriented, for example, and then return it to the original position simply. Here, I'll just hit N to hide that temporarily. If we go back to gizmos, now I can bring up my object gizmos. So let's say I bring up move, rotation, and scale, which can lead to a fairly complicated gizmo, so you might choose to just make one or another one of those available. Let's try rotation, for example. So for this, I have to click on an object, and then this is an object-specific gizmo. So let's say I rotate this thing a little bit around the x-axis, I rotate it a little around z, and I rotate a little around y. So now I've got a pretty complex orientation there. If I was trying to rotate that back into its original standing, its original non-rotated status, that would actually be pretty complicated to do, except I can come to N, click on this object, and now I can just go back down to rotation, for example, and I can zero each of these out, and I can very easily return to where we began. I can do the same thing for scale as well, right? Although, of course, I always get this wrong. Scale, I return it to 1, as in 100%, to get back to my origin cube. So that's all well and good, but later, once we start getting into more complex modifications to these objects, it's going to be important to accept our transformations. So let's go, for example, here and make some more rotations again. And then I'm going to use, here's some of the first hotkeys we're going to start getting used to. So I'm going to go to, I believe it's Control A, and that's apply. And then here I can say, among many other things, apply all transformations. And when I do that, you'll see now that the rotation says 0, 0, 0. So as far as this cube is concerned, it is in its original position. And I won't be able to then go back in here and zero things out to return it to its original state. So just keep that in mind. You've got the ability to transform things in terms of location, scale, and rotation. And if I hit N on the keyboard and go to the Item tab, I can sort of see how that thing is in a live sense, right? In an editable way. It is remembering its original position. I can return back to that. However, if I go to Command A, at least on the Mac, and apply those transformations, it'll zero everything out here, which you have to do for certain kinds of edits moving forward, but we'll come back to that later. Okay, so I'm just going to restore my cube just through hitting undo to the original position. Okay, great. Next up, let's talk about some Boolean operations. And in order to do that, I might take this object and scale it up a little bit. I should also note that, this is a good thing to talk about with transformations, that there are hotkeys, of course, for these as well. So if I want to move something around, and I don't want to do this with the gizmo, so let's turn off the object gizmos. I can, for example, hit S for scale, and then drag that thing in and out. I can hit R for rotation, and then depending on where my mouse happens to be located, I think it's rotating essentially around the axis formed by the camera angle. So let's hit escape. But if I hit R, and then I also hit Y to talk about the Y-axis, now I'm just turning around the Y-axis. And I can also be more specific by then typing in a number, say like 45, and then hitting enter to accept that. So now if I go to N, I'll see that I have a 45-degree rotation around Y. So it's the exact same thing as typing it in over here. It just depends on whether you like to do things visually or numerically. So that was scale and rotation. Now if I do G for grab, and this is funny, right? So M is not how you move things. It's G for grab. So G, and then let's restrict by, say, the Z axis. And now I can move it up and down. And if I wanted to, I could type in like a specific number of units, say 3 or whatever, and hit enter. Okay, so I've got that object there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about adding new meshes to this environment, because I've just been working with this default cube, and then also starting to get them to relate. So the hotkeys for adding stuff would be Shift-A, and I have my add menu with all this stuff right here. If you want to find that in the menus, you should note that right now by default we're in object mode, and that's going to change later. And I can add, for example, a mesh. So let's add in here a sphere. Here's my little sphere down here. Maybe I'll hit S for scale and make that a little larger. And then I can also hit grab and just kind of eyeball this and change the way it's intersecting with this object. Okay, so these are basically all the primes I've got to work with. So I can add in cubes, spheres, cylinders, cones, toruses, and so forth. Okay, so I've got this object added. Let's go in here and do a Boolean operation. So Booleans, a lot of people find super confusing, but they're really foundational to 3D modeling in general. They go back to computer programming and math, where you're thinking about, if I have X and I have Y, do I take the two and I add them together? Do I subtract one from the other? Do I maintain their overlap or exclude their overlap, and so forth? So there are ways of two pieces of data to interact. There's also two main ways to get this done that I'm aware of, and there's probably more. One of it is through modifiers down here, which is a little confusing, and I'll come back to later. So for this, let's put another add-on into Blender. So I'll go to Edit and Preferences, and I'll do a search for Bool Tools, B-O-O-L-T-O-O-L. And I think this one is installed by default, but you do need to check it to make sure that it's active. Okay, so I have these two relating. If I hit N to pop this menu out, and I believe it's under Edit. So here are a couple of things that I've installed. Auto Mirror is another add-on. And we can do what's known as an auto Boolean that doesn't require as many steps. So in order to get this done, I'm going to, I always get confused about the order, but I think I first select the object that I'm subtracting from, and then I'm going to hold Shift and select the object I'm subtracting with. So this is the part that I want to come away. And then let's click here under Difference. And you see I've reversed it by accident. So it functioned, but it was the opposite of what I intended. If I hit undo and then click over here somewhere, it is actually the object you're subtracting with, hold Shift, and then the object you're subtracting from, and then I hit different. So this is one way that we can start to bite chunks out of something. Okay, so the rest of these should be relatively apparent. Union is just going to add things together. Intersect is only going to keep the parts of the models that are crashing into each other, and slice is going to remove everything that's overlapping. We're not going to touch the brush Booleans for now. Let me hit N to hide that. Okay, so we've got this little object here that's starting to get a little bit more complicated than just a simple cube sitting there on the plane. Now, in terms of the way that we look at this object, we have a couple of options. If I click over here, and this is at the upper right-hand corner of our 3D viewport, If you've messed around with the GUI scaling and you don't see this, you might need to scroll your mouse wheel up and down while your mouse is hovering right here, because sometimes these get hidden over here on the right-hand side. So there's 4 main ways of looking. I can look at this object and I can see it just as a wireframe. That's also going to be the least taxing on your computer if your computer's kind of bogging down. Right here I have shaded view, which is just going to give me nice flat shades and a kind of estimation of shadowing. This is my materials preview. We haven't added any materials yet, so this doesn't look too much different from shading. And then over here is finally the rendered view, which is going to look funky until we take some extra steps. So let's stick to shaded view for now. And we'll talk a little bit about lighting and cameras. You know, I think what I might also do is rotate this guy so that area is kind of facing up. So it's a little clearer what's happening with our shading. Okay, great. Now, by default, when I started out this file, I had a light object right here and a camera. So in terms of the camera doesn't really make a difference until it comes to rendering time. So it's important to know where the camera is facing. And to figure that out, I can click on this little object right here underneath the gizmo. So if I click on the camera, I can see that right now my object is not very well aligned in terms of how the camera is pointing. So to address that, I'll hit N, and then we will go to, I believe it's View, and I'm going to click on this little box down here, which is under View Lock, Lock, and then Camera to View, I believe is the full thing that it says. And what this lets me do now is that now when I'm manipulating the scene and kind of flying around, the camera is going to move with me. So I can arrange my object in here exactly how I want it to be photographed, you know, by this virtual camera. And then once I'm satisfied with how my camera is pointing, I can uncheck this, hit N to hide that menu, and then click the camera off. And perhaps you remember, you might have seen it before, that the camera used to be over here, and now it's sort of shifted to the other side. It's possible to move this camera just like any other mesh, you know, so while it's selected I can grab it and I can move it around and stuff, but I find the easiest way to set up the camera is doing it through the end menu view and locking the camera to the view. Just make sure that you turn it back off again once you're satisfied with where it's at. Okay, so we have our camera set up. Now our light is in kind of a strange place. So you can see right now that it's sort of sitting almost right on the corner of this object here. So let's take that and grab it with G, Z to constrain, and move it up. And maybe I'll move it up even more. And then what I can also do at this point is Shift A to add a new object, and let's add a mesh plane, and we'll scale that way up just so that we have this guy either sitting on something or maybe it's, you know, slightly hovering above, but that's fine. It'll just cast a little shadow. Okay, so if I switch back into my camera view, I'll be able to see that the plane is almost fooling us into thinking we have a landscape there. So let me scale it. I'll scale it on Y specifically and then move it slightly out. This is looking good. And then let's switch over into our render preview, and we see that we're pretty dark. Okay, so that's easy to address. Go back to shading, and we want to find our light. I'm sitting in front of a light in my own house right now and having trouble seeing it. There we go. Okay, so let's take our light, and we're going to head over here into the properties area. And then because the light is selected, I'll go down and I'll have access to this light bulb tab. And click here, and I can see that currently the color is white, and that's great, and the power is 1,000 watts. Now, a 1,000 watt light bulb sounds pretty bright, but it's all relative in this kind of space, so I'm just going to turn this up to say 10,000 and hit enter. Nothing will appear to change in the shading tab, but once I move back over here to the render preview, we can see that things are starting to look a little better. I also might take this guy and G for grab and move it down in Z, and you can really see the brightness update live like that. Okay, so that's starting to get us in the right direction. One note too about shadows, often really hard shadows look kind of fake in this context. So one thing that I like to do is go down and change the radius of the light, and the larger that the radius gets, the more diffused that the shadow gets. At the moment, sometimes you're going to get this weird shadow that looks like a bunch of hard shadows bouncing around, but that's because this is more of a rendered preview, and we're going to fix that up a little bit better as we move forward. I'll also come over to here into my side view and maybe try to get this guy more or less sitting back on the ground. Something like that. Okay, so the shadow's a little bit more believable. So you can see as I rotate, the computer kind of has to pause and then update what we're seeing there. And if I move back to my camera preview, things are starting to come together. Okay, so we're actually getting pretty close to where we're going to actually make a render of this and output it and see what it looks like. So before we do that, let's add some materials. And before we do that, the first step will be changing our default renderer. So here I'll click over here. It looks like sort of the back of a contemporary DSLR camera, and you'll see the first thing is that our render engine is Eevee. So there's a couple of render engine types that you can get to at Blender, and as of Blender 3, huge leaps forward have taken place in terms of the Cycles renderer. So Cycles is a little bit more challenging to work with. It's harder on the computer, but it gives you much better results if you really play with it. Eevee is good sometimes for doing stuff on the fly if you want that render just to happen super quickly and be very immediate. But this is what happens if I turn on Cycles. So you see here we've actually got light bouncing around, and at first we have some issues with graininess and noise, and then those go away over time. You may have noticed over here that we were getting a report back. I might be able to get it again if I move this. You can see we're doing sampling all the way up to 1024, and the image will slowly just refine and get nicer and nicer over time, and that's going to happen every single time we reset the view. So if that graininess bothers you, you can make sure you're just looking at the material or shading preview, or you can set your render engine to Eevee, but for right now I'm going to leave it on Cycles because that's the ultimate type of output that I want. Depending on the type of computer you're sitting at, you might find that selecting GPU compute speeds things up. I haven't really noticed a difference on my laptop, and it may be because my MacBook graphics card doesn't have CUDA support. Let me tell you, the sort of rendering and gearhead backdrop on this is about as deep as you can care to go. And so I'm just really skimming the surface, and some of these things are going to change based on the limitations of your particular computer. I also do like to have denoise checked down in here because that's going to help get rid of some of that graininess. Okay, so we have our default renderers set up and so forth. So let me click here again on this object, and let's talk about setting up some really basic materials. So materials are a quick way that you can just put a simple color, and you can do some stuff with like metallic shininess and so forth. This isn't texture painting, so texture painting would be like if I wanted something to look like skin or look like stone or whatever it happens to be. At the moment, we're just sticking to materials, which are a lot simpler, but you can get a lot done with some of your basic materials. So down here, I'm going to head to Material Properties, and this is while our little sculpture is selected. I might pull this over too so you can kind of see what I'm doing. And right now we have a default material that's ready to go, so maybe I'll rename this cube. And at the moment, the base color is just white, so let's change that to something more interesting, like in the kind of orangish territory. It doesn't matter what you pick, just pretty much anything but white. And then as I get down in here, man, there are a ton of variables that you can mess around with. One of the ones that I always like to have at least a little bit is Subsurface. So Subsurface is going to have to do with the light kind of penetrating the material and then bouncing back out. And the cool thing is that you can have a different subsurface color. So that just tends to make things automatically look a little bit richer to me. Particularly around where you have these hard corners in the material. So play around with that, and then get down in here and screw around with these. I mean, metallic is a simple one to mess with. Roughness can lead to some really nice kind of absorption of light. And then I'm going to leave the rest of these alone and let you mess around with them. Alpha, I'm sure, really relates to transparency or something like that. So play around with that stuff and see what you get. But for right now, we're just interested in not having the sort of default white color. Let's add another material while we have the background plane selected. And this one we're just going to call BG. Maybe I'll have this thing sitting on a base color of maybe green. Oh, that's kind of eyeball hurting. Yeah, something like that maybe would be nice. And you can see once we get the contrasting colors in there, I mean, it just starts to improve the basic look of the thing so much, even though we've barely done anything at all, right? So we have a base color. I'm not really going to worry about a subsurface for the background, although maybe I'll make this thing slightly darker. Really help our guy pop. Okay, so we're in a pretty good spot. So let's actually generate a render and see what this looks like. I'm going to head up here to render and then go to render image. And then I'll get this little window that pops up. So by default, we're going to go through over and over again until we get all the way up to over 4,000 samples. And that's probably going to take quite some time unless you've got a really powerful gaming rig that you're sitting on. You can imagine that it will take even longer with more complex objects and lights and so forth in the scene. So we can watch this thing for a little bit and see if it gets somewhere tolerable. And you can also compare it to Eevee if you like, but for the purposes of these demos, I always recommend Cycles, particularly since it's been improved so much as of Blender 3. I think it's a lot faster than it used to be. So we'll let this thing go. For a basic demo like this, that actually looks pretty good to me. The amount of grain doesn't really bother me. It looks more like just a little bit of texture or something. And I'm only at sample 26. So unfortunately, you don't have the opportunity to save this unless you stop it, right? So if I go up here to the top, and image save is currently X'd out. So I'm going to hit escape once. If I hit escape twice, I think it closes the window. And now under image, I can say save as, and then I can save a copy of this thing onto my desktop. So those are the basics. We didn't make anything super incredible, but we did take a look at geometric primes and then how you can get those geometric primes to start to interact in order to make more complex forms. We did the basics of materials, lighting, and camera work, some stuff about navigation, hotkeys, the setting up of preferences, and so forth. So now you have the essentials under your belt, and in the next video we'll move on to more complex stuff.